On December 7, 1958, the Martin family, Ken, Barbara, and their 3 daughters left their Northeast Portland home to search for Christmas greens in the Columbia River Gorge. They were never seen again. Now, after 6 decades of speculation and dead ends, writer J.B. Fisher has unearthed the meticulously preserved case files of Detective Walter Graven, a man who spent years obsessively tracking whispers and shadows, promising to illuminate the darkness surrounding the secrets of this mystery.
This was in fall of 2013. My wife and I were cleaning out our garage in this house that we'd moved into earlier in 2013. And our garage had become kind of a mess with our young kids. That was our focus. So we didn't put as much attention to the garage. So we started to clean it, and we kind of moved over to the far wall where the water heater was. And I saw these pieces of paper or fabric, something which I'd actually noticed before, and I was kind of like, what is that up there? And they were sitting under a piece of plywood. So I moved the plywood, and then I realized they were about half a dozen old newspapers. And I brought them down, and my wife and I were checking them out. They were all Oregon Journal articles from December of 1958. And so I started to look at the headlines. There are all kinds of stories, of course, but almost every single issue had something about this missing Martin family. One of them was about how this abandoned car had its hubcap stolen. And I was like, what's up with that? I had no idea what that was. But they all had something to do with this family that disappeared from Northeast Portland right around that time, December of 1958. So pretty quickly, like maybe the next day, I started to just think, what happened? Did they ever find this family? I'll just Google it and try to figure out, because it was like 5 people. So I went on Google, and there was almost nothing. But a little bit of the information online had some kind of mysterious information, like the car had been pushed off a cliff over at the Dalles, and that this detective who had been working on the case had followed leads that most of the investigators weren't looking into. So that really piqued my interest. But it was like 5 search results. Now if you go on and you Googled Martins, there's all these podcasts, all kinds of stuff. But back then it was almost nothing. So I called Multnomah County Sheriff's Office, and the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office had an interesting response. They said that yes, there is a file, and it's something that I could come in and take a look at. I went over to the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office. They sat me down in the interrogation room with this big stack. It was like that of the files. And pretty much this sergeant said, help yourself, let me know what you want me to photocopy. So he gave me a little stack of Post-its, and I started to mark pages. And then as I was reading it, pretty quickly I noticed that there were reports that were written by Walter Graven. And every time I got to one of those, there was just something wild. Each time it was like some strange clue, or it was something that said confidential, not for press, or it said something about coincidences in the case that were being revealed to this detective's higher-ups. So I started to mark all of those with the Post-its, and pretty soon I realized I didn't want just individual reports. I wanted the whole file. So once I found these really interesting, singular, and kind of unique reports from Detective Graven, I figured, let me look him up, see if I can talk to him. I went to the internet again and found out pretty quickly that he had passed away in 1988. But given what you can do on the internet, I also quickly learned that his grandson, Greg Graven, was working in the police department over in Yamhill, Oregon, which turned out to be just a short drive from McMinnville. So I got in touch with Greg Graven. And as you can imagine, at first, it was pretty limited in terms of what our conversations could be. You know, I said, I found these newspapers. I'm trying to figure out about this case, what your grandfather may have known. And pretty quickly, I got to read that he knew about this case and that it had a big impact on his life as well. It took a few conversations, and then eventually I went and met with Greg, and he opened up more about the kinds of stories that he had learned from his grandfather, some of the kinds of clues and other kinds of developments that were going on all the way until Detective Graven died in 1988. Because as I learned from Greg Graven, Walter Graven had never really put the case to rest. From Greg Graven, I learned that his aunt, Gloria, Walter Graven's daughter, was also still around and actually had a suitcase full of materials from her dad. And so Greg suggested that I get in touch with her. When I realized that there was this potential trail from material, that really got me going, because then I thought there's probably some information in there that, you just can't get anywhere else. So one day we met, and she had this old suitcase of her dad's, and she opens it up, and it's full of his notebooks from cases. And again, I hadn't really ever done this kind of research, but I'd done a lot of research in my areas of literature and history, and enough to realize that when you have primary documents, especially in a case like this, there's a kind of singularity to it. Like you're hearing someone's voice from the past talking directly to you. So when I found out about the story in these newspapers, I think what really intrigued me the most were a couple of things. First of all, that mid-century period, the 50s, always kind of captivated me. It seemed like a period where there's more to it than just the kind of leave it to beaver wholesomeness that we often get sold on. And so I've always been curious about that. And also something about the car, the family station wagon, this 1952 Ford station wagon, just seemed to be kind of iconic in the sense that it was like, here's this huge piece of machinery, and it's still missing to this day, probably in the river. And I just remember being kind of intrigued by that from the start. And then the other part of it was the Columbia River Gorge is one of my favorite places. I love it there. It's so beautiful, just an overwhelming natural environment to be in. And so when I started to read about how this family disappeared there, it had this really kind of intriguing element to it of, here's this beautiful place where something really mysterious happened that's still mysterious to this day.
The Columbia River Gorge was formed about 17 to 19 million years ago, which in geological time, that's like last fucking Tuesday, right? It's very, very new. And it's formed by successive Columbian basalt flows is what they call it. Not every volcano in the world is like Hawaii that explodes and erupts like this. There are fissures in the crust, and sometimes that lava comes up and it gets pushed and it gets pushed. And that's why when you're in the gorge, you see these beautiful layers of that Columbian basalt. There's columnar basalt, there's more regular basalt, but it looks like layers of a cake. Absolutely beautiful. So that is about 17 to 19 million years ago. And about within the last million years, the Columbia River has really kind of established itself in the river run that it's in now. Kind of about a million years. So again, not very long ago at all. Now, about 17,000 years ago, the Missoula floods came through that area. Massive lake of water during the last ice age up in Montana. There was a dam in North Idaho that would hold that water back, and every 40 to 50 years, that dam would melt, and that water would come rushing down the Columbia River Gorge. It didn't so much erode it as it gave it definition. It provided what we see to this day. So that's the history of the gorge and why it looks looks so rugged and raw. And a lot of that is because it's a national scenic area. Actually, the largest national scenic area in the United States, over 290,000 some square acres. Ronald Reagan gets the credit for signing it into law, but nonetheless, that's why it is as beautiful as it is today, is that it has really been preserved. So when you go to the Columbia River Gorge, you're experiencing what it looked like in 1958.
The Martin family were a quintessential 1950s Portland family. They were Ken Martin. He was 54 years old in 1958. He was a electrical appliance service man. He had his own electrical appliance service business. His wife, Barbara, was 48. She was also very much involved in the goings-on at church, and Girl Scouts, and then also in the neighborhood. The Martins had 3 young girls. Barbara, known as Barbie, was 14 in 1958. Virginia, known as Jenna, was 12, and Susan was 10. And then there was an older brother, Donald, who was 28, and who was actually living back east in New York. He was stationed in the Navy at Fort Schuyler. There was a gap. There was a gap in age. Donald was 28. The oldest daughter was 14. There was a definite gap there. So there were these 3 young girls in the house, and the neighborhood was really vibrant. There were all kinds of like parades and holiday activities that they would do. I mean, really just typified that sort of mid-century kind of wholesome family environment. This is the neighborhood that the Martins lived in the 1950s, and Portland at that time was really kind of in a boom zone, like a lot of the U.S., right? Post-World War II America, there's a lot of growth, a lot of production that had happened during the war in Portland, especially around shipbuilding, made for a lot of continued industries and other kinds of opportunities in Portland. So it was definitely a growing place. It was a place where, especially in neighborhoods like this, a lot of kind of middle income people were able to live. Ken Martin had a appliance repair company, and a lot of his neighbors were in similar kinds of work. Definitely wasn't, high income earner kind of area like it may be perceived today, like it is today. Sunday, December 7th, 1958. The whole family's home early in the morning. They're getting ready for some activities of the day. Some extended family members came over around 10 a.m. to visit. The youngest daughter, Susan, went over to a neighbor's house to shoot BBs with the neighbor boy in the basement. Some other friends of the 2 older girls came by to do some collaging. So there was all kinds of bustle going on. And around mid-morning, Ken and Barbara received a call from some family members, some second cousins over in Southeast Portland, inviting them to dinner on Sunday night. And the Martins said, they usually did that. They appreciated the invitation as usual, but they were gonna not be able to make it because they had plans. And so when the extended family members asked, what are these plans? What are you guys doing today? He said, well, we're gonna go up the highway to get Christmas greens. And going up the highway for Portlanders at that time meant going out to the Columbia Gorge. And then they were kind of pressed on it, like, what, can't you come for dinner? And they said, we're gonna stick to the plan. So they headed up the highway over to Columbia Gorge on Highway 30, which was the Columbia River Highway. And at this time in the 1950s, there was a new water level highway that had been built through the 1950s that was now recently open. And that made it nice and quick to get out there. So when the Martins drove out that Sunday on the Columbia Highway, they were headed out on Highway 30 there, the water level highway. We don't really know what they did or where they went over those next few hours. In the initial days of the investigation, a lot of people came forward claiming to have seen the family car, the white and red station wagon with 2 parents and 3 daughters over at Larch Mountain, looking for Christmas trees, and at various other spots throughout the gorge. But most of those were later on either discounted or just simply assumed to be some kind of coincidence. For instance, at this time in early December, as you can imagine, there were lots of families starting to look around for Christmas trees and Christmas greens. And actually at this time, even though the station wagon looks kind of unique today because there aren't too many of these left, this was a pretty typical car. Certainly a family station wagon was a really popular car in the mid-50s. Around dusk, a waitress reported seeing the Martin family at the Paradise Snack Bar in Hood River, which was even though it sounds like just something you'd walk up to, it was actually a restaurant called the Paradise Snack Bar. The witness, Clara York, said she served the family and was very much certain that that's who she saw. And that's really the last time they're seen. About 4 p.m., December 7th, 1958, the Martins essentially vanish. So the day after the family went missing, on the morning of December 8, 1958, a mysterious black taxi was parked outside of the Martin house for about half an hour, and a neighbor going to work that morning noticed it, and as she was walking by, she noticed the driver kind of slouch in the seat, as if just kind of trying to stay out of the way. And the taxi cab stayed there for about 30 minutes. There was a cab in front of the Martin house, and potentially someone was in the house coming for some specific reason. And it does get interesting there too, because when Donald Martin came back in June of 1959, one of the things he did tell Detective Graven was that some ledger books and other materials on his father's desk were missing. Donald Martin finally comes back in June of 1959, and he meets with Detective Graven at that time. Detective Graven's conversation with Donald Martin didn't seem to yield too much in the way of results, but it did seem to cement in Detective Graven's mind that Donald Martin wasn't really the center of this case. He crossed out the name Donald in the notebook, and I used Photoshop to see behind the redacted text there. So when he wrote, "had to be planned by blank, no one else with motive," he seems to have changed his mind and shifted away from Donald. So how did that happen? Well, it seems that when he met with Donald, and from subsequent information, he came to find that Donald had this friend named Wayne, who Donald was very close with at some point earlier on. It turned out the two had lived together. So who was Wayne? Well, it turned out that Wayne was a high school coach over at Cascade Locks High School, and that he was there at Cascade Locks when the family came. And Detective Graven became increasingly interested in this question of who Wayne was and what the Martin family would have been coming to Cascade Locks to see him for. Detective Graven identified Wayne as gay, and Donald Martin was also gay. Later on, this would become a piece of information that news reports would cover in the early 2000s at the anniversary of the missing family and at other points, but this was a secret to the family at the time. So one of the things about the investigation over the first days and weeks that the family was missing was that really no one was 100% sure where they went. It seemed that the gorge was a good possibility, but there was a lot of question there. Could they have gone to the coast? Could they have gone up to Mount Hood or somewhere in southwest Washington? The Martins were really fond of going on trips to different parts of Oregon and Washington, take in all the natural scenery. So there was a lot of question there. So a lot of agencies got involved pretty quickly. Something like 5 different law enforcement agencies searching everywhere from the Oregon coast, southwest Washington, covering Mount Hood, covering the gorge. And no one was really finding much in the way of leads. So there were a lot of people looking into this case. In fact, over the first few weeks and months, it ballooned into what to this day is still considered the largest, or at least one of the largest now, missing persons investigations in Oregon history. So this was also being covered in the papers almost daily. So both the Oregonian and the Oregon Journal, the 2 major papers in Portland, were full of stories leading toward Christmas about how this family disappeared, how Ken Martin played Santa Claus, all these things that of course were just creating a lot of interest, right? A lot of people compelled to either call in and say that maybe they had a lead, or at least to want to know, what happened to this family. So there was a lot of buzz about this story. And then sometime around December 23rd, 1958, so a couple weeks into the investigation, a gas receipt from a service station in Cascade Locks in the western part of the gorge turned up in the Martin mail. And it was sort of a strange development because all their mail and all processing of bills and that sort of thing had already been blocked. So it wasn't actually supposed to have made it, but it showed up. And so Charlotte Dorsey reported this gas receipt that showed that the family had bought gas in Cascade Locks sometime around the middle of the day. So now with that receipt, there was a much clearer indication that the family had in fact gone to the Columbia Gorge that day. And part of that too, it's important to point out that there aren't a lot of places that a car can just drive into the river off the highway. Cascade Locks, the old government locks there, when you go into that parking lot, there's no real guardrail even to this day. Cars can definitely go into the river directly there. And in part because that's such a likely place for that to happen, at least in an accident, that was really the center of the focus.
Cascade Locks wasn't the first federal construction on the Columbia River. You had a canal around the rapids at the Dalles that predates it. But Cascade Locks was built in the 1890s, and it's the first lock mechanism that we have on the Columbia River. Now, the other dams wouldn't go in until the 1930s. That's when Bonneville went in and so on. So that was pretty much it for a while. But nonetheless, it really kind of helped to clear that area of river navigation so you could head up towards the Dalles. Now you also had the Bridge of the Gods, which was built there in 1926, but they had to raise it quite a bit once the Bonneville Dam went in and they closed the spillways and that water level raised so much. I think that's another thing that people have a hard time wrapping their head around, is how much lower the Columbia River would have been in 1958 because of the amount of water that has been caused to back up to create a large reservoir. There's a tremendous amount of water that would not have been there in December of 1958.
The idea that the Martins went into the river by accident was really the prime focus of Cascade Locks. And of course, the idea was they came down here, down this road, and then came down to the locks to look around. It was a pretty warm day. There was some slushy snow still on roadways and parking lots. So one idea was that they had come down here, went right to the edge of the locks, and then Mr. Martin, driving the car, he put his foot down heavily on the accelerator and went forward into the locks instead of, maybe meaning to, be in reverse or something like that. Yeah, Cascade Locks really represents the accident theory, the idea that if they ended up in here, then there would have been just a careless mistake, like stepping on the accelerator in drive instead of reverse.
I do a lot of dive for hire. That's all summer I do that, where I get phones and keys and expensive glasses, stuff like that, motors, guns, back for people. Once I started exploring this place, the locks, I realized that this is a bigger project and it needs some subterranean work. So I'm 50 feet down and then digging 6 or 7 feet below that, right? So it's a really interesting environment to work in. It's very dark all year round. Because the amount of current, even at the slowest time of year, the diving here is super dangerous because there's so much stuff that's thrown into the river here. There's shopping carts, there's salmon nets, there's rocks, there's boulders, there's trees. Whole trees have been down there with the root ball and the branches. So it's definitely a place where if you're going with the current, you might get stuck forever. So it's basically a big concrete canal, and a lot of detritus is built up over the years. But then the pit is a place where it goes from being 40 feet deep to about 50 feet deep. And there's a big bulge of rocks, almost a reef of rocks that people have thrown in over the years for fishing pole hold downs and stuff. So all that's collected down there. There's tons of bodies of salmon, of deer, of dogs, of bones everywhere. I mean, I'm always on the lookout for human bones. There's computers, there's stuff that's been chucked, there's phones, crazy things. Generally, when I go down, I'm out of the current because I'm slightly below it. So I go down and duck down into that pit, and the front of the pit is equal to the concrete bottom at 40 feet, and the back of the pit is about 50 feet deep. So I'm working in that kind of wedge down below, and I'm using different types of sensing devices to find magnetic anomalies of a car. It is a very dangerous place to dive. The entrapment hazards alone, I mean, and that's where I almost met my end, was I knew that wasn't where the car was, but I wanted to document just some of the mechanisms that were still existing because the rest have been stripped out on this. And so I've been really interested in the history of those locks as part of this mystery. So I was diving around it, and there was a giant ghost net, a salmon net, that was streaming out over the top of one of the doors. And I, in a moment of not being careful, I ascended and came up into the net basically, and so it tangled my leg, my arm, the GoPro that was here, my regulator, everything was tangled up, and I was still kind of floating into the net more. So I really had to come up with a plan pretty quickly, and it was October. I was out here alone, and I really came so close. I didn't have that much air left because I was on my way back, and it was sloppy and it was terrifying, honestly. And there was all these dead salmon in the net, right? Of different stages of decay, because the salmon swim up over the doors to migrate, and they are just constantly getting caught in that same net. And so it occurred to me, I looked around when I was tangled, and I see all these dead salmon of different states, and I'm just like, this is what happens here. Like, those are the words, and that really, this is what happens here. This is a place of darkness, of death. I mean, I don't know if it always was, but it is now. I mean, once you're under there, it's a tough place. A lot of bones. Yeah, and the car would have gone in at that right where the bridge is now. So there was nothing to stop something from just rolling straight into the river. And Kenneth Martin was known to have bad night driving vision, You know, the car, this was a 1950s car, it was December, it was dark. So for whatever reason, the car went in there, and I believe it stayed right there December, January, February, March, April, and then May, the current is really picking up with the snow melt, and the car starts rolling, the bodies float out, the car continues to roll all that day and all that night, plunks into the pit. The bodies end up down at the dam. And so, for me, it's a real straightforward case of accidental.
And we discovered the pit. I mean, we have updated people's understanding of this whole canal. And this canal is a really interesting place that I didn't really understand the historical and the engineering significance of it. It was some biggest things in the world category events when they built this. Yeah, if it's there, I'm gonna find it, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was there, and then I talked with folks, and they said that there used to be a different Chevron station right here, and that was called Dean Chevron back in 1958. And then it was later on called Russ's Chevron when Ann Sullivan came to investigate in the 1960s. And actually her car is the car parked in the photo of Russ's Chevron, but that was right here. And so when it was Dean Chevron, you know, allegedly the Martins came through here and got gas, which was something that was always part of the story and certainly helped to determine that they had gone to the gorge. So the whole idea that the gas receipt was fake was intriguing to me because I got this photograph. It was actually the press photo from Ann Sullivan's family, and I started looking at it and realizing that there's actual grease pencil of Ken Martin's name, his signature, and then also that the signature wasn't even the same as other instances of Ken Martin's signature that we saw on checks from around the time of their disappearance, other things in the investigative file, and I actually went to a handwriting expert who told me without a doubt that's a different hand. So that was really intriguing, and I started wondering, like, why would they fake him going to this gas station, you know? And I talked with a gas station clerk who worked here at the time, and he gave me really weird stuff. He'd been a student over at the high school where Wayne was, and he was on the basketball team, the football team that Wayne was coaching. And I was like, why, you know, what's going on here? Why would there be this whole thing about faking the Martins getting gas at this gas station? And of course, part of that would be to put them right here at Cascade Locks, to suggest that then they went down to the locks and the car drove in, and that was an accident, and that's how they ended up in the river. Most of the stretches of the Columbia River Highway on the Oregon side have train tracks between the river and the highway. So if you went off the highway, you would end up not in the river. One of the only other places where it's more direct is over in the Dalles area. Just downstream from the Dalles, in an area where the river gets really narrow and there's some basalt cliffs 20, 30 feet high. And the highway doesn't go right by that, it should be pointed out, but an access road does. So Walter Graven was actually involved in the Martin case from the early days of the investigation. Initially, he was looking into the question of whether there was any fraudulent use of credit cards. And then he was also put on, he had some weird responsibilities that were given to him. Like, he was in charge of picking up this water witcher from Seattle who showed up at the Martin house with a willow branch and used family socks on the willow branch to try to divine where the family went. And Walter Graven was sort of pulling his hair out, thinking, this is really kind of a waste of time. And it turned out he was not just looking into those kinds of aspects of the case. He was also finding some really more serious clues. So the kinds of things that he found in the course of the months of the investigation included finding a gun that was abandoned on the highway near Cascade Locks, an abandoned car that people had noticed from the initial days of the investigation, but really what was not being looked into that much and turned out to be connected to two ex-cons in the area who were also seen at the diner where the family was last seen. Later in 1959, Detective Graven found tire tracks going off of the cliffs at the Dalles, and he also found paint scrapings that were later determined to match the vehicle. So he was finding some really enticing clues and leads, but he was also finding pretty quickly that his superiors were telling him to stop bothering with the case. He was told that quite directly. And part of that had to do with the idea that the focus of the investigation was on Cascade Locks and the idea that the car had gone in at the old locks and that it was an accident. And what Walter Graven was finding was that it seemed to be foul play and that was playing out much further east over in the Dalles. And by the way, there are no Christmas greens in the Dalles. It's a very arid, dry environment. If the family was going to the Dalles, they were going there against their will. That wouldn't be a place to look for Christmas greens.
It does seem like the Dalles would be a weird place to go looking for Christmas greens. If you look at the vegetation, it's all about rain. When you start out in Astoria, you're gonna get 80 inches of rain a year. And as that rain moves and it comes across the Cascades there, it decreases. So by the time it gets to Portland area, you're in your 40-ish inches of rain. And then it starts to move up the mountains. And once it hits the peak on those mountains, it decreases 1 inch per mile. So maybe at the top of the mountain, you're at 44 inches, it decreases 1 inch per mile as it starts to head down the other way. So that's why when you get to the Dalles, you're looking at maybe 15, 19 inches of rain a year. And it looks so different, and it's not gradual. As I tell people on the cruise ship, just look for it. It is sudden. It is like a line. It's not a transitional zone. It happens all of a sudden, and it's just because of rain. The geology is the same. It's still the same basalt flows. The topsoil is the same, rich topsoil brought down by those Missoula floods. All of that is consistent. The only thing that's different is rain, and that's why there's no trees starting at the Dalles, heading points east. Just none at all. In fact, the lack of trees was so significant that Lewis and Clark, in addition to bartering for food, they had to trade for firewood too. They would get food and they couldn't cook it because there's no trees around. So this is where it happens, right at the Dalles. So if you're heading up to the Dalles to look for Christmas greens, that's a little sus.
May 2nd, 1959, big front page news in the Oregon papers. The body of Susan Martin, the youngest daughter, was recovered at Camas Slough off the Columbia River. Within a day, the middle sister, the middle daughter, Virginia Martin's body was recovered at Bonneville Dam Spillway. So this was huge because now investigators knew that something happened in the Columbia River. So these two ex-convicts, one of them was Lester Kenneth Price. He had driven this 1950 Chevrolet up to Cascade Locks, abandoned it just outside of town. Turned out he was coming to visit. He was from Southern California. He was coming to visit, apparently had a wife in the area. He also was an associate of Roy Light, who was the other ex-con, who had been staying at a place called the Hamilton Motel over in the Dalles, which was only a few hundred yards from the cliff site, by the way. And one of the people we need to talk about here is Clifford Slim Bennett. Clifford Slim Bennett was a major vice player in Portland and in Oregon in the early 1950s, mid-1950s. He ran a bootlegging joint over in the Kenton district called the 8212 Club. He had a couple of brothels out in Central Oregon. He also had a brothel over in Dallasport, Washington at the time that the Martins disappeared. And in fact, Detective Graven went and talked to him at his brothel in Dallasport about the Martin case. So one thing that had happened with Clifford Slim Bennett was that he was a major figure in this big Portland Vice probe because over at his 8212 bootlegging joint in 1955, he'd allegedly given a bribe to Mayor Terry Shrunk. And this was a big story, and it really led to the beginnings of what became a national investigation into labor corruption that was spearheaded by John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And again, this stuff gets complicated, so we're going to keep it really simple here and say that basically Clifford Slim Bennett took the Fifth when he was hauled off to Washington, D.C., along with a number of other key players in the Vice investigation. He took the Fifth, protected the mayor, protected other interested parties, and basically for his efforts, he was allowed to operate some of his businesses, including this Dallasport brothel, without much interference. And in fact, Graven's family passed down that the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office also had some money tied up in that particular brothel. So the idea that Graven would come over and start talking to Clifford Bennett about this case didn't sit well with the authorities because they've just pretty much gotten him out of the way, kind of doing his own thing, out of the limelight. It would be pretty bad optics for him to show up right in the middle of this missing persons case, including, this neighborhood Santa Claus and his family. So why was Graven going to talk to Clifford Bennett? Well, it turned out Clifford Bennett told Graven that he was harboring these two ex-cons in the days after the Martins went missing, from December 7th to December 10th. And he remembers that they were there until December 10th because they were all watching the big Archie Moore boxing fight on TV. It was a big event at that time. And he told Graven that these two ex-cons disappeared after December 10th and he didn't know where they went. These two ex-cons, Lester Kenneth Price and Roy Light, were connected to the abandoned car over in Cascade Locks, and they were also seen at the diner when the family was eating there that Sunday afternoon. So Graven's trying to get his superiors to take his clues and leads seriously. He filed a report called Coincidences in the Martin Case that laid all this out, including his suspicion about Donald Martin, or at least in terms of what he might have known about what happened to the family. All of this really pointing in the direction of foul play. He tried to get more efforts to investigate the cliff site at the Dalles, figuring that divers might be able to find the car. So he tried to arrange for some dives, and at least one happened there. But it's a very, very difficult area to dive, and especially in the mid-20th century, divers just really didn't have equipment to handle that environment. So they didn't find anything there. And then he also found actual pushback. As we get into the 1960s, dive investigations get stymied by the Dalles police and other law enforcement agencies coming in and saying, you can't look into this here. So
why?
Partly because this was outside of Detective Graven's jurisdiction. But there's also a big question mark. Why were law enforcement agencies so insistent? In fact, there was a news article in the early 60s covering one of the dive investigations saying it couldn't really be publicized because, quote, they didn't want spectators, onlookers coming to crowd around, which seemed like kind of a strange thing to say, that would be a reason to call off a dive for a missing family. So we get to 1965 and things really just kind of fizzle out again. Graven had expected that this would lead to some additional searching, and it really didn't. The dive search at the Dalles got called off completely at that point. So he's helpless. So Walter Graven is really at a point where he's thinking, there's more to this case. There's a lot going on here, and I can't solve it.
Right now we're 40 feet of water. So that cliff is 50 feet. So that drops down another, just like that, another 45, 50 feet. And then as I turn out, and we start heading out this direction, we're gonna go, now it's getting a little, it's like about 40 feet, but it's gonna start dropping off. So now we're at 40, 45, 50. So you'll see and it's all rocks, and if you look on the scanner, everything looks like, almost everything looks like a car. Square,
Yeah.
2 wheels, faces looking out. I mean, literally, I've seen a family of 3 looking out at me from a. So now we're at 140 feet of water. I mean, we're past the limit of recreational diving. We're not recreational divers, but you know, we're now at 150 feet. So there's no reason why, if they were pulling anchors that day out there, and they said they were like what, somewhere like right in here, they were doing some type of work. So if they're pulling anchors and they haul that car, and maybe they're moving. Usually when you pull an anchor, you go into the current to control the boat, and you're kind of moving along. But if they drug the car one way or the other, you know, right out here you got 150 feet of water. It's a really big area to search. Just to search from here to there, just like a triangle, would take us it would take us months.
So then we get to 1967, and I'm not exactly sure how Anne Sullivan got on the case, but she definitely became compelled to look into it. So Anne Sullivan was an Oregonian journalist. She was a very prolific reporter through the middle part of the 20th century. And it turned out that she went to journalism school over at U of O with the current governor at this time, Tom McCall. So she went to Tom McCall and said, we need to reopen this case. She'd been investigating it through 1967. She'd gotten in touch with Graven, found out about all these kinds of leads, talked with people like the waitress who had seen the car and the family at the restaurant that day, talked with a number of other people involved. So Anne Sullivan was very confident that if the governor ordered the case to be reopened, it could be solved. Then what happened was Governor McCall told the Oregon State Police to reopen the case. Anne Sullivan had put together a kind of team of sleuth experts who were going to be involved in helping to figure this out. There was, of course, Detective Graven. There were a couple of divers. There was Donald Bain, an amateur sleuth who had actually found the tire tracks out at the Dalles. And there was an Oregon State Police lieutenant named Howard Benninghoff. And so once the governor ordered the investigation, there was real confidence that Lieutenant Benninghoff could get the ball rolling and actually figure this out. Instead, the Oregon State Police put a different lead investigator on the case, Sergeant Kaczynski. And Sergeant Kaczynski went and talked with a number of different people involved in the case and concluded in a report that was submitted in 1968 that the Martins had simply driven off the highway at the Cascade Locks and that this was an accident, not foul play. So this was a real disappointment for these investigators because they were pretty confident that this was going to lead to actual results in reopening the case, looking back into all these compelling leads, and actually finally finding some answers. So Sergeant Kaczynski, who authored this Oregon State Police report saying that the Martin case was just a simple accident, had also been connected to Clifford Bennett. He actually had arrested him back in the mid-1950s, and also I found in the course of my research a press photo that was never published that shows Sergeant Kaczynski and Clifford Slim Bennett arm in arm with big smiles on their faces, and on the back it says laughing at photogs, which was kind of this mid-50s way of talking about photographers. So they were joking together, clearly well connected. When the OSP report came out that Kaczynski had looked into all this, he said that he didn't really even know who Clifford Bennett was. So that in itself was kind of a red flag for me when I started to think, wait, so people at the heart of this Martin story were also involved in this vice stuff? And you could say, well, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. It sounds like too many moving parts, right? When we think about Occam's razor, the idea is the simplest path. But one of the things about that simplest path is that it also is the simplest path that evidence supports. So with all these different pieces coming into the puzzle, it was more and more clear to me that the straight line in this case had something to do with foul play. This is such an inconclusive case. There's no scene of the crime. There's no whodunit in terms of kind of like motive, in terms of causes, in terms of suspects, even though we have some. Everything is so open. And yet there are these plausible trails that this detective has left. And some of what Detective Graven was looking into seemed to suggest that perhaps this whole event of the family going missing and disappearing had something to do with a family secret. Now, it seems that there was some element there that may have had to do with Donald's relationship with other men, including potentially perhaps Wayne. It's also interesting that Wayne, he was about to get married. He got married during the time that this investigation was happening in the spring of 1959. And then fairly shortly after this, about a year and a half later, he took his whole family and moved to Germany, where they stayed for over 3 decades. And during the time in the Graven notebooks, well into the 1960s, he still has Wayne's name and efforts to try to find more about Wayne. There was also another theory, which was that there was a family secret being held that had to do with one of the daughters, the oldest daughter, being pregnant. And that's a theory that came down through the Graven family. And one of the things about Clifford Bennett's brothel over in Dallasport was that it also would offer abortion services. That was a big part of the sex industry of the mid-20th century, was that places like that would offer those services. So one theory was that the family was going to deal with this situation. Now, very quickly you might say, why would they bring their whole family along for something like that? And of course, one answer to that is that the family did all kinds of things together, and that would be a perfect kind of cover, that they were just going out for Christmas greens, when in reality they were meeting with some party or parties to deal with some kind of a family situation that they didn't want to bring to light.
See, I knew that the whole family intimately. Okay, I have to start with Don, because I met him at Portland State. We were both going to Portland State. I met Don, and we became roommates. And then he introduced me, of course, to his mom and dad and the family. So that's how I got to know the family. Yeah. At 53, we were roommates for maybe, 1 term. Or 3 months or something like that, and then I had to transfer in order to get a degree, and he was transferring at the same time. He was working for Myron Franks. He was a very artistic guy. We were opposite. Here I am, a jock, and a dummy, and he was in the arts and artistic, and he was a decorator, a window decorator for them. And so it was kind of, he introduced me to a lot of things in life that I wasn't even aware of. It was part of my education. He was gay. I don't know if you knew that or not. But picture me, 19 years old, and I'm rooming with a gay guy, and I thought they were queer. The word that we use, things have changed tremendously over 50 years. But I didn't know anything about the gay lifestyle. And he said, I need a straight guy to live with. He was open with me, but he wasn't open with his parents. He was still in the closet. It introduced me to the gay lifestyle then. I carried that with me for a long time, knowing a little bit more about it than I think the average Joe College, like the straight guys, my drinking buddies and that sort of thing. We always told jokes about the queers and the gays. And it was in subculture and very secretive. Don wanted to tell his parents, and he didn't know how. Part of my story is that before Cascade Locks, I hadn't done my practice teaching, so I went to Portland State for practice teaching, and I got a job with the Portland Bureau of Parks, and I was a park director at Rose City Park, which is around the corner. And of course, hi Wayne, how are you? Come over for a barbecue. I would go over to the house and visit with them and stay for a barbecue. And they knew me as, well, they never called me Uncle Wayne, but I was kind of like an uncle. It would have had to be that barbecue during the summer. I probably could have seen them at Cascade Locks. That was the last time they were seen. Teaching at Cascade Locks. And they stopped there for gas. And I knew the guy that ran the gas station that identified them because they had the credit card. And they would have wanted to see me if, so I didn't know about their visit then, but I almost saw them there, but didn't. When the story first broke, somehow my name came up, surfaced, and I'm not surprised it came up. I don't know how it came up, but the detective, who's now deceased, called my mother. My mother and father used to live just around the corner here. And Mom said, Wayne, you know, I told my parents about the uniqueness of me knowing the family and their disappearance. And Mom said a detective called and he wanted to talk to you. So I went down to, downtown Portland, and I spoke to him, and he gave me the information that he knew. And they wanted to know how much I knew, and he had reason to believe that Don was definitely a suspect, but they didn't have anything to go by. The only way he could have had anything to do with it, because his motive would be the inheritance, I think. He was the sole survivor, so he got an inheritance. The only thing I could think of is back in New York City, maybe he ran across, because of his lifestyle, ran across professional killers, way I could see it. And so he'd say $5,000 to kill a family, and so the killer says, okay, give me the $5,000. In a gay lifestyle, they live, underground, and there's special places where you meet, and the gay bars and gay places were not advertised. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Today it's so wide open, that you wouldn't think that at all. One of two things. Oh no, only one thing. Only one thing that could possibly have happened in my mind. First of all, I know Ken and his family, the father and the family, they did not accidentally drive off the car into the river. I mean, I just cannot buy into that anywhere. But it could have been foul play. And somebody drove their car, pushed their car off into the river. He had set up a situation with another gay person at home after they were gone, and the parents came back and caught Don in the act, so to speak. I think he wanted to open up the story of his life, and he didn't know how to do it. So this is speculation that he started this whole thing himself. Said, Wayne, why in the world didn't you come up to us and slap us in the face and say, wake up, your son is queer? And I said, well, I couldn't do that. I mean, it wasn't my business to tell you that your son was gay. We lived in an apartment not far from the campus at Portland State. We lived in an apartment downstairs. And it was like bunk beds, and the part that I didn't even know that Don was deceased until your story came. What is it that you want to eventually do with this? So you're thinking the story goes on. Is there anybody working on a story with the Oregonian? Or no? Would there be any forensic evidence after 50 years that was... They can it's amazing what they can do. So as you know, there's a story there if they pull that car up. If they don't pull the car up, you're right where we are right now. Is there enough interest and enough resources to do it? I mean, we're talking about paying wages to detectives. Well, I certainly think it's worthwhile.
May 5th, 1959. Why the Martin case is murder. The Evans family were there on December 7th in the a.m., stayed until noon. The Martins refused to go to Calvin Welch's with the Evans for dinner. Why? Martin said, "We'd better do as planned." When asked by Evans what plans, Ken Martin stated, "Just for a ride." Yet, they did not leave for 2 hours after the Evans left. It was getting dark at 4 p.m. at that time, yet they left at 2 p.m. to go to the other side of Hood River. This indicates that they had a date to meet someone, as Martin did not like to drive after dark, yet he knew it would be dark in 2.5 hours. It also indicates that they did not want anyone to know about the trip. Therefore, they had a phone call or letter from someone who would give them information about Donald or some other excuse about something they did not want known. The two men at the Paradise restaurant at Hood River came in around the time the Martins did and left before or after, likely Price and Light. Martin got shot, gun jammed. Others knocked unconscious. Car ran into river, someplace other side of Hood River. Will be solved if I live long enough for the car and bodies to be found. Even though I can get no cooperation from anyone, there is no murder that cannot be solved. Walter Graben.
I see it really as ghosts that need our attention in some way. That there are people who really experience some kind of injustice out there, and their voices are lost to history. And the book I'm writing right now really emphasizes that, where we have someone who seems wrongfully executed in 1948 based on their race, and who left behind their own voice in writing that said, "I will always be remembered for the injustices that were done to me." And yet, no one remembers Wardell Henderson. If you Google that name now, you'll see almost less than you would have seen about the Martin case when I started researching that case. And to me, that's really what keeps me going with this, is just that idea that these stories, these kind of ephemeral figures deserve to be remembered. And it's up to us to make that happen. Right outside of the Dalles, Oregon, right before you get to the Discovery Center Museum,
is a little trailer park called the Pinewood Mobile Manor. And the Pinewood Mobile Manor was the location of one of my most favorite Bigfoot sightings, which was in June in 1971, when Bigfoot came just strolling on by the trailer park in the Dalles. Several residents of the Pinewood Mobile Manor and the manager and a couple other dudes are sitting around drinking coffee, and lo and behold, there's a big-ass Bigfoot just walking on by, do-do-do-do-do-do-do. Peter Byrne thought that it was a migration spot for Bigfoots. Maybe the Bridge of the Gods was incorporated there. Maybe that legend of a land bridge crossing across the Columbia that both man and beast would take. There was the lady that owned the property right next to the mobile manor, and she said she couldn't keep her ranch hands all the way back in the 1920s. And she asked one of the guys, "Why do you keep quitting? Is it the pay? Is it the food?" He says, "No, ma'am. Pay is great, food's fantastic, it's them goddamn gorillas that keep walking by this place every night." And this was the 1920s, you know, so I mean, this area, the mobile home area, goes far and deep into Bigfoot territory. There's all kinds of theories there on the Bigfoot.